Hello, I'm Holly Folk. I teach comparative religion and I research new religious movements. I'm an associate professor at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. I was contacted by some of the representatives from Taiji Men. I am not an expert in Taiwanese tax law, and I'm only starting to study your spiritual organization, but I have an awful lot of sympathy for your case, and I'm here today to say a little bit comparing Taiji Men's case to other cases around the world. When we think about religious persecution, we sometimes think of heresy trials or people are burned at the stake or the Spanish Inquisition. But in the present day, religious harassment is more likely to take place in the form of illicit and unfair court cases. And so tax laws, zoning laws, being able to have occupancy of a building, these are the kinds of instances where religious minorities find themselves persecuted today. It's very, very easy for bureaucracies to create legal barriers for religious groups that individual bureaucrats don't like. They're able to use the public perception of religions that are small against those religions. In other words, the fact that a religious group is seen as a small community is allowed to be used to portray that group as controversial. And then the court or the bureaucracy is allowed to perpetrate basically campaigns of harassment against those organizations. This has happened in France, it's happened in Israel, it's happened in the United States. We see cases where people think that they've won a victory, they think that they've achieved tax-exempt status, or they've won a court settlement, and then they find that the court proceedings are allowed to drag on for years and years. In France, there's a zoning issue that has continued against the holy city of Mandarin since the mid-1990s. And so for a case concerning the religious status of a group like Taiji Men as it pertains to tax law in Taiwan, I have a lot of sympathy, because in these types of cases, what's being judged is the religious legitimacy of the group. In other words, the tax evasion question, the tax status question, these are the kinds of things that are used to put the entire legitimacy of the religion into full view and to undermine the status of a community, to say it's not a real organization, to present groups as criminal. We see the case with Taiji Men, I see the case with Taiji Men in a way that's very, very isomorphic to other religious communities that face harassment. And so when we think about, for example, the Lukumi decision in the United States had this case in the 1990s where there was, I think, a Santeria group in Florida. They won a decision that allowed them to continue to hold their rituals. And the Supreme Court in the United States said basically it's illegal for a government, whether it's a local government or a state government, to target religious communities. The fact that religious communities are sometimes targeted as religious minorities is something that's been deemed illegal in American law. In other words, you can't pass a law in the United States that singles out a particular religion's practices for persecution. This is something that other countries are starting to catch on to, but it's slow to happen. You know, as in it's becoming an established principle for international democracy, but biases against religious groups sometimes still mean that certain groups are very much unfairly targeted by the law. There's an interesting comparison in the United States with the Lukumi decision, which happened in the 1990s. There was a spirit possession group in Florida that was holding animal sacrifices as part of their ritual. And the county in Florida passed an ordinance making it illegal for them to have their rituals, even though slaughterhouses were operating nearby. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the decision that was passed down established under American law that governments cannot pass laws that specifically target individual religious minorities. And so in other words, a city government, a local government, a state government can't decide, we dislike the activities of this religion, and so therefore we'll pass a law that will make it very, very hard to do its practices. And so this has become very important because in the United States, you would think that there is freedom of religion, and yet we do in many, many places, city governments, local governments, using very basic bureaucratic laws to set up obstacles and to do this against religions that are controversial. And so the Lucumia decision has become one of the ways that Americans basically make an appeal to say, the government cannot target, my individual tradition, my faith practice. And this is sort of funny, because if you read the past 25 years of American Supreme Court case laws, this has become very, very important. And yet the community that pushed this through was a very, very small group. I mean, a few hundred people. And so in that sense, I can appreciate that if taiji men is successful in terms of firmly establishing the platform for recognition of this model of a religious institution, that will have effects for other religious minorities whose practices are sometimes held up in question. In the modern world right now, there are very often questions about, is a particular community a quote unquote real religion? And that's happening because the way that people are doing their religions is changing, right? So people are pursuing health or spirituality or different types of creative activity, and they're not necessarily going to churches or temples and performing the established rituals of several hundred years ago. But that does not mean that they do not have active religious lives with things that they take very seriously. That does not mean that these new groups are not providing firm moral guidance and a sense of completeness and communities for people to participate in. And so in that sense, by being able to expand the scope of definition for religion, I could see taiji men having a very, very positive effect for Taiwanese society.